Hello, everyone, and welcome to AGO from Home. My name is Bojana Stancic, and I'm the Assistant Curator, Live Projects and Performance at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Today, we meet in the virtual role, but I would still like to acknowledge that the Art Gallery of Ontario operates on land that is the territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga Nation and was also the territory of the Wendat and Haudenosaunee. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Built Covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. I've been hosting this weekly program for the last 2 months, first as a way to keep in touch with our audiences as well as artists and celebrate things that we got to do together, as well as support in any way we could explorations into the new post-COVID future for performance and congregation, which is very much part of performance as well, or has been so far. Now that we are reopening slowly, our focus is shifting as we go back to the place we knew, but having to acknowledge we're coming back to it with new eyes. To help us on this exploration today, to inform us about these new eyes, today we have two esteemed colleagues of mine, AGO Archivist Marilyn Nazar and artist and academic Seika Boye, to share their perspectives and research into a site we all know and love, the Grange Park. By focusing on a singular place, we will talk through ways we establish meaning, inscribe value, and participate in knowledge creation. So it is an extension of the archival memories, nostalgia for a place, institution, and people who make and frequent them, and how they may be more accessible in this new post-COVID moment. Welcome, Marilyn and Seika.
Thank you. Thank you, Brianna.
So the shape of the conversation will be two short presentations by the speakers about their areas of research, after which we will engage in a conversation between the three of us. But I think that Marilyn and Seika have more to say to each other, and I'm super happy to listen in. So maybe we can start with you, Marilyn, about sharing your work.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So I had chosen an image of the Grange Park. That was donated to the AGO Archives in 2018 from a collector of all sorts of things. And it came to us through a now retired interpretive planner at the AGO, David Wistow. And it came from his brother-in-law, who just collected all kinds of things, and I'm not sure where he got this. But it's a particular view of Grange Park dated around circa 1924 by an Ontario College of Art student, José Clouton, who not much is known about. We know that they studied at least between 1924 and 1927. And had won quite a few awards, but I don't think they practiced since. I don't know why, but they've just never really practiced. But this is their interpretation of the Grange Park circa 1924. And what I love about this image is that it really talks about a transitionary time, I think, in the life of the park between from it being an estate, the home of Harriet and Goldwin Smith in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and this estate that originated in 1817, built by Darcy Bolton, that actually extended all the way up to Bloor Street in Toronto, down to Queen Street between McCall and Beverly. So it was actually quite a large landmass. And this house was originally built in, the Grange House was originally built in 1817. A very, so to that estate, to it being bequeathed as the first home of the Art Museum of Toronto, now the Art Gallery of the Art Museum of Toronto, now the Art Gallery of Ontario. And it just, I love it because it really is about this transition. And I wanted to look at this space as a transitional space. It's still, I think, very much in transition, and has been since the redesign of the space in 2017. We completely redid the park. It had been really run down. And And so we had completely redone it. But in this, you can see the sort of leisure activities. It's very sort of the white relief and it's very white. It's very sort of colonialist in its history, very Anglo-Saxon. You know, it's sort of, in this case, she privileges the Ontario College of Art, but I love even the quote around, out of the arts come delight, color, warmth, this kind of very romantic, very idealist notion of the arts. Say it's circa 1924 because OCA has been built, which opened in 1921. The first galleries of the art, the first galleries back here of what's now the AGO were built in 1918. But if you can read this, it says that there's more to come, and that this is just the birth of the gallery. So they had already been planning to build Walker Court as a homage to Edmund Walker, who was one of our founders. George Reed was another one of the founders of the Art Gallery of Ontario, and also the first principal of the Ontario College of Art, and the president of the Ontario Society of Artists. So you can kind of see this working together of these artists and patrons of the arts, very much a white, male, Anglo-Saxon, colonialist, very rooted in that environment. You know, Arthur Lismer was another part of that group, and very prominent in establishing our gallery school. You know, you can see that the property is still at this time, you can see it's still gated all the way around. So while it's supposed to be a public space, it is actually not really that accessible as a public space. You know, very much gated completely all the way around. And so there's this inside and outside of the space that I think is really worth looking at, really worth examining. So we inherited Sir Edmund Walker. The property was bequeathed by Harriet Smith, who was the last full owner of the property. In 1902, once she and Goldwin Smith, her last husband, died. So we took the property over in 1911, and we immediately had an arrangement with the City of Toronto that we would own the park, but they would maintain it. And so that's still the arrangement today, is that we own the park, but the city now maintains it. And with the last reiteration of the park that opened in 2017, in 2008, we formed a committee with the City of Toronto, of the Residents Association, and a lot of the businesses and groups within the neighboring community to come up with the new design for the park, which of course has gotten rid of all of these gateways and opened up access to the park quite a bit, and access actually to the gallery, which I think we can talk about later, through what's now the south entrance, which would be over here at this point. But at the time, I think it was a very closed space, and mainly used by the gallery and by the college. And you can see, if we flip to the next image, you can see these are Ontario College of Art students using the park. And you can see pretty much the rest of the park is empty.
I feel like I can recognize those two trees also.
Yes, I think, yeah, I'm not quite sure if those are the same trees, but it does look like those are the trees where yes. But you can actually still see, yeah, there's still the same pathway up to, up to the Grange house. But it's very, I really love this because the park is really empty and secluded in a way, and it still feels very much in the 1920s as part of this estate. and as part of this sort of institutionalized space, I think, very much so. So I'm really interested in looking at the park. It's not something we've explored that thoroughly in our own history, even though we've owned it. And I think it's a good time to do that, because we haven't really looked at that even from the design, even from the 2017 new redesign and opening up of the park. But as a public space, I think there's a lot that has been negotiated around that space and access to that space that's really reflected and reflective of our own institution's history and the history of probably the college as well, and how intricately linked they are together, not only in their founding, but as they've operated since. And how this space is sort of this intermediate, this buffer almost between those institutions and the public, even though the city of Toronto runs it and maintains it. And I just, so that's really what I wanted to do, is sort of present that as an opening discussion and dialogue. And I just can flip to the next image to show, this is from 1968-ish, an image of AGO students, a junior art class through the gallery school, which was founded by Lismer in the 1930s, early 1930s, sketching in the park. And so again, the park reasonably empty or secluded except this class. So it really was this space that was really negotiated, I think, and it has taken a long time to transition away from a more private space to a more public space, even though it is supposed to be a public park in downtown Toronto, and a very dear park to the residents, to the community. The park really became very run down by the early 2000s. And by 2008, I think residents really started to complain and say, well, if you're doing a whole Frank Gehry rebuilding of the AGO, of the art gallery, and then a redesign of OCAD, of Ontario College of Art and Design University, why aren't we doing something with this park? And so this is why the association was formed, and the redesign opened in 2017. But I wanted to show early pictures of that and talk a little bit about the history, and why I think it's been such a difficult space to negotiate. It has to do with that deeply embedded history as an estate of a strong colonialist. William Henry Bolton, one of the owners, was of course part of the family compact. So it was very deeply entrenched colonialist, white, male-centric space. And I think this, in particular, this inside, this very secluded, contained space speaks nicely to some of the images that Seika is going to be showing us next.
Thank you, Marilyn. That is sort of a beautiful opportunity to open the floor to Seika. I just wanted to say the questions around publicness, politicizing sort of like, and ownership is similar narrative of public institutions to sort of like eventually open up to serve the public. And I think part of my excitement about having this conversation today between the two of you was also this current moment of redefining what public is and what access is. So thank you so much for that sort of history. Some of it I knew, some of them is new to me as well. But Seika, would you be willing to share with us your research in sort of like the post-68 moment, and how other public neighborhood community groups ended up taking over the park after that?
You're muted, Seika.
at home with my family. So
Oh.
I think it's important to start, first, thank you, Bojana, and thanks, Marilyn. It's always wonderful to hear you talk about the watercolor. And I think it's important for me to share that I have seen this watercolor before and spent a lot of time looking at it. It was first brought to my attention during my residency at the AGO in 2018-19. Amy Furness brought it to me because she knows about my research and the role of Grange Park and Grange Road and University Settlement House. And so I have been thinking about it for a long time in relationship to the images that are shown here in this newspaper article. I'm a dance scholar, and when I was working on my doctoral research, which was essentially looking for social dance within Toronto's Black population in the 1950s, I was in the process of my research and going through the Globe and Mail digital archive, and I found this newspaper article, which is titled "Wednesday Night's Rock Night on the Streets of Toronto." And the article itself chronicles street dances at the University Settlement House, which is located across the park from the Art Gallery of Ontario. It's on Grange Road. It moved location sometime in the 1950s. It's still in operation today. And these street dances had been happening for 3 years at this point. This image and article is from 1956. And I'm just going to read a brief caption that mentioned both the settlement house and the art gallery. And I'll do that in a moment. But after I found this newspaper article, I became very hopeful about finding the original prints. I had been having a hard time finding images of Black people dancing socially during this time. And it's important to raise that in the 1950s, we're still in a moment of transition in municipally, provincially, and federally of where Black people are allowed to dance. And there, as the Canadian laws went, it was essentially that it wasn't punishable by law to not allow someone to come into your establishment, whether it was a restaurant, a dance hall, a skating rink, a swimming pool. And there are a series of legislations that slowly shifted that over approximately 15 years. And so at this time, when these dances were happening, some of the things that I want to draw attention to are that it's an interracial crowd, and they're all young people. And it became very important to me to be able to look more closely at these photographs. As you can see, the digital reproduction is very poor, and because photography was invented and calibrated to whiteness, the Black skin begins to disappear, and there's some wonderful writing about this. The reflections begin to either white out the Black faces, or they're lost against the darker background. And so I went to the City of Toronto Archive, where I knew the University Settlement House collection was. And within this collection, there are 750 photographs that document the history of University Settlement House from the early 20th century. And so going through these photos one by one, I was fortunate enough to find the 3 prints and more that are included in this newspaper article. And if I can have the next image, please. And so the one that I've chosen to share today is this photo that was taken by Harry McLaurin, and it documents one of these dances. And why it's so important in contrast to the watercolor that Marilyn has shared with us is that on the other side of the fence, we see Grange Park. And so this is also a documenting of the history of this park. As the article says, the Grange Road was cordoned off at either end by police barricades, and traffic was asked to redirect around. And it says that on this evening, there were about 700 people who attended this dance. And these would have been the families and young people who were members of the university settlement. And the settlement house served lower and middle class, working class families, immigrant families, and the Black population, which of course were not families who had been here for generations in some instances. And so we see people from a variety of cultural and heritage backgrounds in this photograph. And what is so, there are a number of really important things about it, but the first is that these are young people dancing together. This is a youth street dance, and I'm going to read a quote from the article now that I think sums up some of these things best. The action starts about 8:30 when teenagers from all over the neighborhood saunter through the park behind the art gallery to form a steadily spreading ring around the blocked off street. When darkness comes, reticence goes and the gyrations begin. The people, and this is a quote, the people who are criticizing rock and roll as degenerate music are the same people who were jiving to the Charleston 30 years ago, end quote, said Bill Stern, settlement social worker who runs the weekly event with Ernest Scrow and Bruce Cook. A final quote, there's a basic need being met here, and it's more than just blowing off steam. Some of these kids are really creative dancers, and around this neighborhood, a good dancer has a lot of status, he said. And that's where the article ends. And so there are many conversations we could have about what the Globe and Mail was trying to do with this article, including trying to depict Canada and Toronto as a peaceful, integrated place, which of course we know well it wasn't. This is a year following the murder of Emmett Till and the trial of those accused of murdering him was about to begin. And so this was the use of photography in the early capital C civil rights movement is very important to note in the Globe's decision to run this photo. But what we're going to talk about today is the separation between the street that the settlement house used as a space for young people to dance. The dances happened on Wednesday nights. There was once a suggestion that they should happen on Sunday afternoons, and there was a petition from the many churches around that neighborhood that the dances absolutely could not happen on a Sunday. It was sacrilegious. And so Wednesday evenings were when the dances happened. But we see this very clear demarcation between the street and Grange Park. And it's not that there wasn't access. We see some people are standing on the other side observing the dance, but the dances couldn't happen in the park. And so I think there's a lot of room for a conversation about why that might have been. And Marilyn, I hope that we can talk about the possibility of correspondence between the settlement house and the art gallery. And I wonder what's out there in terms of negotiating this space. And to bring us around to our conversation, I want to share one final image that is a continuation of my thinking, and I think a bookend between the watercolor that you have shared with us, Marilyn, and the University Settlement House dances, and this very recent New Yorker cover by artist Diana Ihata. And here she's using the same relief and the background, but the bodies are black. And we see a family in the park reading, a black family, young children playing together. And I hope that we can talk about the way these images are used to reinforce colonial ideas, as you've so clearly mentioned, and that watercolor is doing, intentionally or not. This was a young person who was an artist. There's certainly a repetition of the ideal colonial citizen and middle-class whiteness, but we continue to see today how park space, leisure, family, and those depictions are so important as a form of resistance of these colonial narratives. And the University Settlement House, and the settlements came out of the UK in the late 19th century. So we can't ignore their own role in the colonial project at all. It's a very important part of our conversation, and the use of space created for people who don't have access in other places, and that tension and relationship between the art gallery and the settlement. And I think I'll end there, Bojana, for us to talk about these things together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Seika. I mean, I think that in your both presentations, we spanned about 100 years of representation and discursivity around what is public, what is not, how it transitions into publicness, what is visible, what is not, leisure or profession, and also what is archived and what is not. And I think that kind of the qualities of those conversations, I think, are so crucial for us to have now, again, as we're kind of re-entering. So I'm wondering, could you maybe, as a way to start the conversation, think or talk us through what either of you had noticed in changes of representations about community and public space over this time, maybe even informed by each other's research?
Seika, do you want to?
Sure, and maybe I can start where I ended with the New Yorker cover, and that the ways what people are depicted doing in public spaces continues to be a form of resistance when they have continuously been depicted as either violent or working or in other forms outside of, and we've all heard the term Black joy, but living day-to-day life, birding. We understand that the news article and where that, where the response in that the New Yorker cover came from. And so the way that people are depicted in public space and who has access and what they're doing continues to be critically important to our own narratives and how we tell them, but also how other people tell the stories of society and communities.
Yeah, we take a lot for granted in terms of what's in those images, you know, in terms of the kinds of leisure activities. And I love that there's, like, in the original one, you know, the watercolor, there's people playing tennis and there's people strolling, and they're very much, you know, what a sort of an affluent white culture would have been assumed to have been doing at that point. Yeah, very much so. And so that's definitely, it's so clear in the representation. Yeah.
And I think, Marilyn, I would add to that the aspirational nature of what's in that image. And when I think about the people who would have been accessing university settlement house at that time and what the settlements were trying to bring about, which was middle class behavior, middle class etiquette, middle class hygiene, education. And so that what one is aspiring towards and the role that those images have played in desire for assimilation, for example, are so important to be aware of. And there are codes that are there, of course.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The dress, the cars. I mean, yeah. I mean, not very many people at that time would have owned cars, and you see at the top the cars. So yes, it's this very coded image. Yeah, and it also even just the crests at the top, the Ontario, you know, those kinds of coats of arms also speak to that kind of, you know, deeply embedded, institutionalized, established norm. Yeah.
Absolutely. The word that stands out to me from the long title around the perimeter, Marilyn, is the word glory.
Yes, me too.
And perhaps it points most clearly to what those sorts of images, paintings, coats of arms, leisure, middle class were aspiring towards, which is glory.
Yes, but for a certain, you know, it's very exclusive kind of definition of that. Yes, yes, yeah.
I'm curious just to sort of like bring up, both of you had spoken about ownership, and we talked about sort of the Art Gallery Ontario coming from private hands into public status, like so did the Grange Park. Do you have a sense that sort of in this new moment of, you know, coming back to the world, that sort of ownership can be redefined, and how could you imagine it being redefined in a way that's more equitable or accessible, and sort of goes along with our kind of like newly established values and sustained?
No, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think this is so small, but you know, the ownership starts to be redefined, I think, in the relationship that the AGO has established within the neighborhood in particular. And that's not always been a smooth relationship. In fact, it's been quite rocky at times. You know, in terms of some expansion, there's a great love of the park in the neighborhood. And so there have been some expansions that we've done that that the neighborhood itself has felt a really curtailed use of the park and access to the park, and that's been problematic. And so I think with this last iteration of actually redesigning the park itself, you know, really the committee to redesign that park, which again consisted of the art gallery, the City of Toronto, the Residents Association, and then different businesses and groups from around, from the neighborhood coming together. I think it was a committee of 15 representatives that negotiated that. It took from 2008 to 2017 and funded by the Weston family. So again, you get who's, you know, and you look at whose money comes into this. Where does that money come from? So I mean, it was not just funded by the Weston family, it was also funded by the City of Toronto, and the AGO threw money into it, and so on and so forth. But there's that patronage again, right? That comes into ownership and representation of that. So you know, it's as open as it's ever been, but still, I think, you know, how we move forward and really open that up, yeah, it's going to take a lot more work than that, I think. Yeah.
I think that in terms of that opening up as well, and what the history of the institution in relationship to the park and the communities, the people who live, the residents who are in that area, and this decreased access to the park, I think is so important right now as we're thinking deeply about the importance of outdoor spaces during COVID. And the need to be able to go outside, to engage, to socialize. It's safer right now to be outside together. And so I think we're all deeply reconsidering the need for parks and access to parks, and being in parks without suspicion. And suspicion is one of the first words that comes to mind, thinking about the park and also the relationship to the art gallery. And we were speaking briefly beforehand about how the south entrance has been opened up, and you would be able to speak better to this, Marilyn and Bojana, but that people can move from the park into the lower level of the art gallery without paying the fee to go in. But at what point within that extension is there no longer welcome, or when do you need to pay for continued access into the gallery spaces, for example? But also coming out of the gallery, when I was in residence there, and we were also talking about this, Bojana, how difficult it is for the gallery to hold events in the park, to get permissions to do certain types of things. I am a dancer and a dance scholar. What would it mean to hold or have a party with loud music and with people dancing and young people in that space? Who decides what's appropriate to be happening there? And who has access and power? And these are all of the questions and the words that we're asking over and over again, in terms of deciding who can do what and when. And not only once you're granted, not only about being granted permission, but once you have that permission, being in that space with a feeling that is carefree. And that's something that strikes me so much about that watercolor, is that the figures in it are depicted as so carefree. What does it mean to be free of care like that? What does it mean to not have concern about what you're doing? What does it mean to not ever have that experience? And so how can we think about Grange Park and the institutions on either side of it, and how that question has been, how it's a site to ask that question, like you said, Bojana, over a century. And even though the fence has come down, the fence is so clearly in the watercolor, it's so clearly in the photographs that were in the Globe and Mail, it's no longer there. But that physical barrier doesn't mean that other barriers haven't come down at all, right?
Not at all, not at all, yeah.
I'm curious to bring up two sort of moments just that came out from when you were guys answering. One is sort of suspicious the opposite of joy? Joy is being one of the words that you picked out in the sort of like the watercolor piece, and suspicion and the carefreeness being maybe visual representations of access. That's one thing. And the second thing, I think I was trying to sort of think about ownership also as an extension of who issues the invitation. And Seika, you were also talking about the Wednesday night events that were happening in the park. Again, who has the sort of the invitation capacity? Where does that sort of moment of generosity comes from? Especially if it is a shared space. Let's assume that sort of like this is kind of like a neutral, equitable environment. And so I think that those are, you know, other aspects of maybe how to move forward, not to problematize too much, but also address them so that we can anticipate future conversations that are a little bit more shared maybe. I'm wondering if you can respond.
An invitation, of course, it's such a critical part of this, even with permission. And one of the questions that I ask in my research about that photograph, and I mentioned that it's all young people, is would that dance have occurred in a public space if it were an interracial crowd of adults? And what is at stake when adults are dancing together? You know, the dance floor is the gateway to sexual activity and miscegenation and that fear. And in my interviews with people who attended those dances and knew about those dances, it was okay for a young couple to dance together. But what changed when you left the dance floor? What was allowed and what was permitted, and what was the fear beyond the perimeter of that dance floor? And age is something that we can't ignore in talking about the settlement house. It certainly served young people and adult populations, but also with the art gallery as well, right? The family center downstairs, and what does it mean for how is a person as they age based on the visibility of their background perceived in that space when they're 2, when they're 6, when they're 13, when they're 18, when they're 20, and so forth. And so understanding that along with an invitation needs to come consideration of the relationship once the invitation is accepted, that it isn't just about saying, hey, you can come into this space. It's about the relationship on an ongoing moment by moment basis once you're in that space, which requires intention on the part of all of the individuals who work for an institution.
Yeah. Yes, I would. Yes, and it's interesting how we build that community and build those relationships. And I think that's, the biggest part of, I mean, I speak mostly about AGO in the past because that's what I know as the archivist. And Bojana, maybe you can speak more to the current about how those relationships get built, and how we're now struggling with that, I think, in terms of redefining how those relationships get built. And part of it is just, you know, with the community. And it's interesting that early you had been talking about correspondence with the University Settlement House and the AGO, and I've never been able to find it since we spoke when you were doing your presentation. I cannot find any ongoing correspondence. So, and again, I don't know why. You know, there's these structured absences, you know, because we did keep records even before there was an actually official archives. So I don't know where that would have ended up and why it didn't get kept.
Yeah, I think it's, I've looked as well in the Settlement House collection at the City of Toronto archive, and I wonder in part if it isn't because the institutions are so close to one another that really people could just meet halfway across the park and have a conversation if need be. It's hard to imagine that there wasn't some relationship between individuals, even if it was based on the very clear fact. There must have been some very clear understanding about the limits of how the settlement house used Grange Park. I would imagine.
I would imagine so.
So yeah,
but you know, speaking of it, there's actually very limited correspondence between the art gallery and the colleges and OCAD-U as well. And one of the only things I can find is sort of a draft of the initial agreement to sever off part of the land at the very beginning in 1920. Agreed build. So again, it's how do these relationships get formed and how do they get documented is always, you know, it's so important to be able to trace that history. And we realize how important those kinds of records are in being able to trace that kind of history and build a relationship. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what changes in terms of accountability when the Arts Council starts to become a part of the way that the gallery is operating. And the patron relationships, the personal relationships between those families, that correspondence may have been, that's part of their personal estate records. And what starts to happen in terms of accountability and access to those records when the Arts Councils come into being, following the Massey Commission, is a big question and a big shift in the legislation and in the ways that the institutions operate within themselves and between one another. Some of the only correspondence I could find were the letters of petition from, I think it's 7 different churches who obviously organized amongst themselves to put a stop to dances for young people on Sundays. And it's it's been archived in a it's hanging on the front. It says Sunday dances, 1943 to 1954. I may not be exact in the dates, but it's nearly a decade of correspondence and follow-up about whether or not those dances can happen.
And my understanding was it wasn't just Sunday they opposed, it was the dances at all.
Yeah.
They really said, can't have that.
No.
When you read out the word gyrating and sort of the article, I was like, okay. It has a totally different sensual and body like revolutionary ethic. I'm like, okay, let's start. Good.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think the article is fascinating in that it doesn't ever directly mention race. It doesn't ever directly address that, but it speaks about class. But the images, and there are 3 there, are very much about the interracial dynamics within the group. And the language goes back and forth to the author, the journalist is very intentionally using words that are racialized. And earlier in it, he talks about the Stade Art Gallery of Ontario and really, really pinpoints the tension between the 2 institutions.
Seika, may I ask you to maybe just talk us through the original inspiration for you to go down this path in archival searches that has eventually became your doctoral thesis? And because I'm curious about sort of like the archive moment, and I'm going to ask Marilyn the same question after, but I think this is a little bit more sort of urgent and...
Of course, and stop me if I go on. I'll be aware. So I am a dancer. I grew up dancing from the time I was 3 and did the jazz tap ballet, and then went on to a professional training and career in modern and contemporary dance, modern and postmodern dance traditions. And when I stopped dancing, I went into journalism and also worked at Dance Collection Dance, which is a Canadian dance history archive and publisher, the only dedicated Canadian Dance History Archive. And my first task when I started working there, when I was doing my master's in 2004, was to update the file collection. So if you're familiar with archives, or if you aren't familiar, there are files, and then there are boxes and offsite storage. And so I was going through the files, which is about 500. And in updating them, I had this very quick, in-depth, immersive experience into Canadian dance history, but there were very obvious omissions. And one of the greatest omissions was a reflection of myself in that archive. And so eventually I decided to pursue my doctorate and to ask the question, where were Black people dancing in Canada, especially in the first half of the 20th century, or before 1970, really, which is when the immigration laws started to change. Mm-hmm. And so my work really involved looking for Black people dancing in the archive, looking for traces of Black people dancing. And it is not something that has been prioritized in the larger institutional archives. So you can't do a keyword search. If you put in Black dance, Globe and Mail, 1950, the articles that will come up will be a dancer with XYZ ballet company was in a black leotard. So you need to change the keyword search terms, and the term in use at that time was Negro. And so my research really was a process of trying to find what appeared not to be there. Although of course Black people were dancing in Canada, and of course there was trace record documentation of that history for the stage, socially and otherwise, and in between. And I very quickly in my research decided to focus on social dancing as opposed to dancing for the stage for my dissertation, because I wanted to have a broader sense of the role of dance within communities for everyday people, as opposed to someone who may have been in an exceptional circumstance of having a dance career. And so when I did find this newspaper article and that these dances were happening publicly, and that they were organized, and that they were interracial, it became such a valuable case study for so many things, at the foundation of which is the project of the Canadian nation state. And that's really where my research and deep learning had to happen over the course of the 6 years that I worked on my dissertation. Was how was the legislating of Black bodies brought to light through asking, where were Black people allowed to dance, and who gave them permission, and who forbade people to be in certain spaces, and the shifts that happened as it became punishable by law, or as you might lose your license when you went to renew your license for your institution, if there were complaints against you for racist discrimination and exclusion, then the dances were banned. So you couldn't do a dance that was racialized. You couldn't do the jive. And so that is the nature of that work. But dance research itself is always the very heart of that, is the ephemeral nature of dancing. And of course, I don't necessarily, the ephemerality is when we're thinking about the dancer themselves and what they carry. And my project was called This Living Dancer. The dances are happening within me all of the time over a course of a lifetime, but that is what my relationship to the archive is that looking for what appears not to be there. And both with dance and with Blackness, it's a very complex question.
Thank you so much for that. I also think what I'm getting from this conversation and in preparation or in thinking about this conversation, the idea of public space being politicized and the idea of archives being politicized is not necessarily new, but it just feels like it has a little bit more of a sharper focus. And Seika, you were in residence 2 years ago at the AGO, is that true?
Yes. Time flies.
It really does. Marilyn, I'm curious for you to maybe talk us through, because of all the archivists that I knew, there weren't many, that's true, but you are deeply beloved by artists, just because I think that the way that you also navigate archives is through a discursive potential. And I think artists often do that. I mean, I'm talking Seika, of course, but also Pamela Matharu sort of references you all the time, and Pamela did an amazing talk as well for AGO from Home. I'm just curious, what is your relationship? What prompted you, what motivated you to kind of be in this field, and how do you define your relationship to it?
Well, here's the thing. I started off as an artist. So this is why I would probably, and I started off as an artist, sort of based in Toronto, artist-run centers and collectives. So very much sort of a more grassroots kind of approach. And I first got introduced to archives because I was doing a residency in Dawson City, Yukon, an arts residency, and I was really interested in the gold rush because obviously it's a city that is in and of itself is almost like a museum dedicated to the gold rush there. And I wanted to know, for me personally, how did women, I mean, because you could go to the graveyards and you could see babies and women, and there was a whole little Jewish graveyard that was separate and a Chinese graveyard that was sort of separate. And so I was like, how did these people, what do I know about this? And so I started working with their archives, and I loved archival research because it's but it's very politicized and difficult because things aren't necessarily organized by subject in archives. They're organized by the way the collections come in and by the way the records are kept. Context is everything in archives. So, but nonetheless, we use descriptors, and it's in that kind of description process that it becomes the act of being an archivist becomes very political. And I became interested in that from an arts point of view, and also maybe somewhat of a feminist point of view, and thinking, in some ways they're so impenetrable, they can be so difficult to access and do research. And how is it that they're described? And in a sense, with archives, the history has always been preservation of the record takes precedence over access. And I think that has been shifting a lot since the time I started to work with archives. And I went back quite late in life to do my master's in archival science, and have been very lucky to work at the AGO because I've been able to sort of shape and form what does that mean in terms of the AGO archives. And that's the thing. Access has never been the primary, unlike libraries where access is everything. In archives, it's about the preservation of the document. But for me, it's like, well, what are you preserving it for if not to be used and reused? And when you look at a process like the Truth and Reconciliation, the oral testimony against the documents, and the documents, how else would we know and truly understand without those government and missionary documents, that absolutely wrote it in stone what happened in the residential school system. And so and be able to take those documents and correct and work at some sort of, this is the first step in reconciliation, is to actually someone to come in and take these documents and rework them. So when I have someone like Seika come in, or Pamela come in and be able, or Deanna Bowen come in, or anyone come in and sort of rework, be able to look at our history and rework it and unearth things that need to be taken a second look at. And that's one of the things that I have to work on a lot more. I inherited these archives, and look at a lot more is just really look at how how I'm describing records. because right now there are very limited descriptions of AGO records. We don't have anything up online to tell people what we have even. So that's just really inaccessible, and mea culpa for that. But really thinking a lot about that as I'm starting to describe these records and put that history out there, because it is really, you know, we have so many artists coming through in our history, and it's their history as well, right? As they come through, it's partly their own history as well. So, you know, I think about the recordings, Seika, of from your residency and from this becoming part of that legacy of how we, you know, of how we change and how we grow and how we establish access right here. This is it.
And I think you're right, Marilyn, absolutely. And how do we go back and both correct and add to the record that is available? My project at the Art Gallery was a self-archiving project to ask these questions about what does it mean to have some self-determination in the way that we are remembered? What does it mean to contextualize our own objects while we are living? This idea of a living artist that is so important and prevalent in art galleries was something that I had to wrap my head around. That's why the work was called This Living Dancer, because it's this question of liveness and how are performers being invited into galleries as well, and people who have an embodied practice to help institutions as they think through their colonial histories, as they think through the omissions, but also what is at stake and what are the tensions of the way people are invited. And we've already talked about invitations, Bojana, and what happens following that invitation, including how those engagements are remembered beyond a social media presence. What is how does the archive and the archivist intervene in actions that are only for the institution? What else are they for? Who else are we documenting for? What are the reasons? And I also, I wanted to add, it was something that you said in the beginning, Marilyn, in your last comment, that women's history is another place, of course, where this is so critical. And when I couldn't find images of people social dancing, some of the first mentions that I found were in a labor history of Black women working in Southern Ontario. That's a collection that was led by Dion Brand. And the name, even though I know this collection as well as I know anything, the title is escaping me, and perhaps, Bojana, we can include it later on. So what are the parallel histories? Where can we find traces of what we're looking for? Because when people talk about their work and their labor, they also inevitably talk about their time off from work. What happened on their day off? What happened in a community of domestics who all had a Thursday night off? They had a dance, for example. And so what is the potential for the art gallery? What are the parallel histories that are available in the archive, as you say, that you've inherited? It's such a tremendous responsibility. And I think the values of an institution are so clearly apparent when you look to their archive and what's being prioritized and how things have been documented and what's been given space and who has the privilege of being given any sort of legacy, which are all questions that you're raising, Marilyn.
Yeah, and it's amazing that no one gets off the hook here, because while it's the responsibility of the archives, it's really the responsibility of everyone who keeps those records as they're creating them. That's really when it comes down, and how and we don't create documents for the archives, but we create documents in the way in which we conduct our business, just going about our business, and those come to the archives. So we have to think about that. We have to think about what we're doing as historically important and valuable, that it gets documented. And that's an interesting, that's also right from the beginning. That's it's a political decision to actually make it matter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's so amazing because I think that the definition of access is sort of like changed and shifted a few different times over the course of this conversation, and we're coming to the end of it, and I super appreciate it, and I just wanted to call attention to that. I think when I imagine everybody is committed to access, but what it means for different people, even within one institution, let alone outside of that institution, is something very different. And I think archives is one of those moments, even for me, that feels so internalized and kind of, but at the same time is super crucial to the mechanization of creating culture and authenticating culture, and authenticating public space, of which Art Gallery also is. So I just wanted to sort of maybe take a moment to give you the last opportunity to comment, but thank you both so much from my end for participating in this conversation and really illuminating, even for me, some of the questions around the curiosities that I had over this time, especially now.
I just want to say thank you, Bojana, for the opportunity, and thank you so much for Seika for agreeing to come on, and it's just been so great to see those images and to talk to you about this in more detail. Yeah, it's just been really a pleasure for me.
It's a pleasure for me as well, and thank you, Bojana, for continuing our conversation and the many places our conversations have been. And Marilyn, I have a printout of the watercolor in my office. It's a reminder, really, of counter histories and
yes.
And the ways that things are represented. And so I really value being able to talk this through, especially in this moment where our outdoor spaces are so critical. For those who can't leave the city and go to another residence, for those who are living in spaces without backyards. This is a really fundamental question about our well-being as a society, what people can do in parks and how they feel when they're there. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you both.